of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've joined some of my colleagues here tonight to talk about the most pressing issue in this country, which is job creation, private sector job creation, and what we need to do to get our country back on the path to prosperity and job growth. I had a jobs conference in the 2nd Congressional District, my district, down in Arkansas, in Little Rock, a couple of weeks ago. We held it at the Clinton Library. And it really was an extension of the 25 or so town halls that I've had this year, in that we talked a lot about jobs. And I thought that a jobs conference would be a good idea, because who better to ask about job creation than job creators? So we had 5 panels, over 60 panelists, and I wanted to hear from the job creators in the 2nd Congressional District. And I asked them 2 main questions. What are the obstacles that you face in creating jobs, and what opportunities do you see? And as I indicated earlier, this was really an extension of what I had been talking with constituents about for the 9 months that I've been in office, and even before that. And I expected that I would hear answers to those questions consistent with what I've heard in town halls, in meetings in my office, and throughout the year. And I wasn't surprised. What I heard from the over 60 panelists that gathered at the Clinton Library in Little Rock a couple of weeks ago, what I heard was uncertainty is the #1 obstacle to job creation in this country. Uncertainty. Now, I've heard that word used a lot since I've been here. I heard it a lot last year when I was traveling around the district before I ever came to Congress. And it was pretty clear to me, has been pretty clear to me, and still is, that uncertainty is the biggest problem we face. The job creators gathered in Little Rock at the jobs conference were from manufacturing industry, energy industry, healthcare, retail, financial services, aerospace, infrastructure, construction, real estate, you name it, agriculture. We had folks from all across the spectrum, and they all indicated that uncertainty is the biggest obstacle to job creation. Now, what kind of uncertainty were they talking about? Well, the #1 type of uncertainty cited by job creators was regulatory uncertainty. They indicated at the conference, at this jobs conference, that #1, in many instances, they know new regulations are coming, but they have no idea what they're going to be. And so they have no idea whether they're going to be able to comply with those by spending a little extra money, no extra money, or a whole lot. They're also concerned about regulations that are floated. They're floated out by the agencies as a potential regulation that may or may not be implemented. And those sorts of regulations give these job creators great pause, because they don't know whether they're going to have to comply with them. And it's not just one agency, and it's not just one industry. I will say that the EPA's name came up more than any other. The job creators made it very clear that there are a number of regulations coming out of the federal agencies that they are concerned about. And the EPA has issued a number of regulations, and some that are yet to be enacted, that these job creators were very concerned about. I heard from the panelists the common theme that they're not against regulations. We've always had regulations, at least ever since I've been around, and we're going to continue to have regulations. And we need reasonable regulations, keep our water and air clean. I've got a 4-year-old and a 19-month-old, and I want them to have a clean and safe environment. But we're not talking about just regulations, reasonable regulations. We're talking about excessive, overly burdensome regulations that in some cases require such drastic steps to comply that they just run people out of business. We've dealt with a lot of those here in the House, trying to reverse some of the stuff coming out of the administration. I heard from our energy industry, Entergy Corporation and the electric cooperatives. Some of the panelists represented those companies, and they indicated that if some of the EPA rules are implemented as they have been proposed, they could result in the shutting down of several power plants in Arkansas, with a potential impact of raising energy costs 25%. Now, these same panelists said, look, we're not necessarily against this sort of regulation, the sort of regulation they were referring to, but the time frame for compliance is so short that there's no way. It's almost humanly impossible for them to comply with some of the EPA's mandates. So we heard a lot about the EPA, but not just the EPA. HHS, Department of Labor, many other agencies here in Washington that put out regulations, often with no or little regard to the impact those regulations are going to have on the folks back in my district and around the country. So regulatory uncertainty was specifically identified as an obstacle to job creation in this country. In addition to regulatory uncertainty, there's uncertainty over the health care law. Is the health care law even going to be implemented or not? Certainly, I voted to repeal the health care law that passed in the last Congress. I think we need health care reform, but not the health care reform we got. Now the courts are looking at the health care law, and there's a good chance, in some folks' opinions, in my opinion, that the Supreme Court might strike the individual mandate portion of the President's health care law, the health care law that we have now. So there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that. There's also uncertainty over our fiscal situation. The President had a perfect opportunity to lead after his bipartisan debt commission came out with some recommendations. I don't agree with all of them, but it was a good place to start. But instead, right after they came out with their recommendations late last year, early this year, President comes out with his budget. No reform of Medicare to save it. No reform of Social Security to save it. No reform of Medicaid. Just keep on spending. So missed an opportunity there. But the debt is a part of that uncertainty. The debt impacts our currency valuation. It impacts our markets. You don't have to look far. You can just look at what's going on in Europe. It's sort of like you're looking in a crystal ball, and what's going on in Europe is potentially, not identical, but potentially in some regards, our future. That's where we're headed. More uncertainty. So it was very clear after listening to all these job creators. The problem is not that the federal government hasn't spent enough money. We've spent $1 trillion on the last stimulus at a cost of about $300,000 per job. Discretionary spending has gone up 84% under this administration. I don't think, in fact, I know that spending is not the problem. It's the uncertainty that the job creators addressed. So what we're going to talk about here tonight, what have we been doing for the last 9 months to address the uncertainty on regulations, with regard to the debt and our spending, with regard to our tax code so that we can remain competitive? What have we been doing here in this body, in the majority in the House, to address the uncertainty that I think is beyond dispute is the biggest obstacle to job creation in this country? And I'm citing the job creators in my district. We've been doing a whole lot over the last 10 months. Passed a lot of legislation. I think we've had about 800 votes. Unfortunately, a lot of those good ideas are stacking up like cordwood over in the U.S. Senate. We pass it, send it down to them, they stack it up. That's the way it's worked for the last 10 months or so. So I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues here. Thought we'd talk a little bit about the different things that we passed that the American people would have heard a lot more about if they had been acted upon and become law. But most folks don't hear a lot about them because they go down the other end of the building and they just sit there like that little bill sitting on Capitol Hill that some of us grew up with as a cartoon. If it's just a bill, it's not a law. So I'm happy to have my friends join me here tonight on the floor to talk about jobs and what we've been doing in the House over the last 10 months.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding.